And now, the next presentation is by Behrooz Gharleghi. Behrooz is the senior researcher in our institute, in the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute, and he is running the project on macroeconomic policies in developing countries together with your humble servant. Please, Behrooz, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as Vladimir said, this paper would be on central bank independence, inflation, and economic growth. But I mean, at the end, we will just cover the impact of central bank independence on economic growth. But we touch in the middle about the interaction between central bank and inflation, and also inflation and growth. However, the inflation and growth and Cbi and inflation have not been econometrically investigated. I mean, we have just surveyed the literature. So the main objective of this study would be to identify the relationship between central bank independence and economic growth for a set of developed and developing countries. The literature that, I mean, we have surveyed so far has shown, I mean, the literature has grown recently, and it shows that, you know, the recently developing countries are receiving attention as much as developed countries do. So we found studies that they have just analyzed developed countries and studies that they have done developed and developing. I mean developed and developing countries, but the number is relatively low. So the main basically argument here is to see whether an independent central banks would contribute to economic growth or no, by considering both developed and developing countries, and if, I mean, there is no clear picture on that, so what we should do. I mean, we tried to somehow find some answers, but this has not been finished yet. This project is still ongoing. I mean, what we have found, previous studies and in the literature, mostly they covered central bank independence and economic growth. I mean, the relationship between these two variables. But there are studies where they have taken into account the impact of some control variables in order to basically improve the results and also take into account the impact of other variables that might influence this relationship. We also taken into account government effectiveness, corruption perception index, shadow economy, level of GDP per capita, and population growth rates into account to basically see whether these variables can moderate the CBI and economic growth relationship. Okay, so as I said, we have categorized this basically scenario of the impact of CBI on economic growth into three. First one is inflation and economic growth. The second one would be central bank independence and inflation. And then the third one would be central bank independence and economic growth. So basically, I mean, earlier, growth and inflation are usually thought to have a direct relationship, which is refers to normal Phillips curve. But recent literature has shown a changing scenario, that this relationship may not be always direct and even may not be long run. The World Bank Growth Commission has noted that very high inflation is damaging to growth, but it remains circumspect about how high is very high, and acknowledge that some countries have grown for a long period of time by having a persistent inflation of 15 to 30%. In this scenario, people have identified threshold. I mean, we may not be able to say the direct or inverse relationship between inflation and economic growth, I mean, forever. But there is a threshold. I mean, we should find that threshold, and we should look into that. And that threshold obviously comes for developing countries and developed countries. Well, inflation is a typical disease in developing countries where governments usually try to print money in this situation to basically increase salaries, pensions, and subsidies to reduce the basically social stress of the community. However, Taylor rule recommends a contradictory monetary policy when inflation is higher than target. But inflation at the same time, inflation targeting may not allow price flexibility, which is necessary for developing countries. And a negative relationship between inflation and growth exists only when inflation exists several dozens per year. So the literature, suggests different results. But some literature, some studies have suggested that 40% could be the inflation rate that basically is harmful. So if inflation goes beyond 40%, it's harmful. But as long as it is below 40%, it actually helps economic growth. And then I quickly just run through the various literature by just quoting the findings that they have. For example, Polterovich warned about making declining inflation as the main goal of government of Russia, arguing that it could hinder economic growth. And many economists consider any inflation destructive, while others argue that very low inflation bring a small benefit. So whether if inflation is high is destructive, low inflation also seems to not to be helpful. But we should also highlight Stiglitz's a study that he said there is an agreement that no economy can successfully function with hyperinflation. There is no consensus on benefit from low inflation. Well, it means that we need some sort of inflation. That we will refer to this argument at the end of the presentation. And we have found, you can see the word negative from those studies that basically they have been conducted in various contexts. In the context of transitional economies, this relationship found to be negative. In the context of Asian transition economies and China, it was, and also 26 transitional countries, against it found to be negative. But Khan and Senaji, they find a negative relationship between inflation and growth that goes beyond the threshold of 11% for developing countries and 1% for industrialized economies. So that's basically the level of threshold. And Seperi and Moshiri, 2004, for the case of OECD economies, they find a threshold level of 11% to 16% for low-income countries, 15 to 21% for countries with lower middle income, and 4 to 5% for the countries with upper middle income level. And the effect of lowering inflation below the threshold is statistically insignificant for low and lower middle income countries. Therefore, they basically advocated of having some sort of inflation. All right, so I just try to, not to spend too much time on literature, but this is the impact of CBI and inflation, and this is where our study basically, the impact of CBI, reveal its impact on inflation. CBI affects economic growth through inflation, and mostly you will find negative relationship between CBI and independence. It means that an independent central bank, reduces inflation, and that's basically the the goal of having an independent central bank, because mostly they wish to have a tight monetary policy, so they control printing money. Therefore, inflation drops. But now the question is, if inflation drops, it is helpful for the economy or no? And this is the third category, which I mentioned, Cbi and economic growth. And this is where we did some statistical analysis. And a very quick literature that we can find out, we can see here, for example, Olicina and Summers, they find that central bank independence promote price stability, but it has no quantifiable effect on economic growth. Zuckerman find a positive impact of central bank independence on growth for less developed countries and no impact for developed countries. And Garriga, basically this is the paper that we used as the main, reference in terms of data. She found a significant positive relationship between Cbi and economic growth in developing countries, and a negative but non-significant for developed countries. And again, for the case of EU members, a positive relationship was found in short run and long run. Well, in another study by Zerboyani, Anastasio, and Anastasio, they studied 39 countries, and they find no evidence of central bank independence on reducing economic instability, nor on increasing employment. Lower inflation and then they argue that lower inflation is a result of institutional and structural factors, not from having an independent central banks. And some other studies. However, we should take an important note is that having an independent central bank would be helpful if we have a normal economic situation. When economy is not facing stochastic shocks. If we have such shocks, having a central bank independence may worsen the situation. For example, if an adverse stochastic shock reduces employment and aggregate demand, an independent central bank will not react by decreasing interest rate or expanding money supply as an elected government would do. This situation ends up with a deeper recession. So this is also should be taken into account. That I believe we also touched on this at the end of the presentation, but just a little bit. All right. So in order to basically identify this relationship, we have, as I mentioned, we have some variables, but we have a longer time span in the panel format. But in order to basically get a robust picture of the situation of this relationship, we use 5 years average. So our economic growth, which is our dependent variable, we have, you can see the source of data, and then you can see the proxy. We use GDP, PPP per capita as the economic growth, as a dependent variable with a block of 5 years, and we have taken the geometric mean. And for the period of 1970 to 2015, that results in 9 observations for each country. So for each country, we will have 9 observations for economic growth. The central bank itself, this is basically the main variable that we have taken into account. This, there are people that basically, we can see that who developed central bank independence index. In order to calculate the central bank independence index itself, it's a project. It's very complicated because it contains a huge number of questions and other elements that needs to be taken into account. But we did not touch that part. We just use the results that have been produced. Using this database, I mean, we have taken it from Anna Carolina Garriga, who is a professor at University of Essex. Sorry, yeah, thank you. And she developed the database. She basically used Zuckerman, Webb, and Nayati database based on the 4 elements of central bank independence with their weights. So, for example, CEO carries 20%, which is about the appointment, dismissal, terms of office, and so on. Objectives, 15%, policy formulation, 15%, and central bank lending, 50%. However, this is basically how this index has been formed. But the latest data for central bank independence exists only up to 2012. So we had to do some sort of adjustment in order to make the best use of the data. We have shadow economy, we have population, we have corruption perception index, and government effectiveness. I mean, I just go through, and that's the GDP per capita itself. All right, how about the results? We used, as I said, this is an ongoing project. We use various, techniques to see, which one can capture the impact of CBI on economic growth. At the end, we took fixed effect model, but we perform, two different models, 2 different regression, one in a quadratic format that we have introduced these 2 interaction terms. One is a linear interaction term, which is the multiplication of CBI by GDP per capita. This is our dependent variable. And the other one is the square of the same interaction term. So this regression, as you can see, some variables were found not to be significant. So we have excluded those, and then we just kept the variables which are significant. And this, this would be the regression at the end of the day. And then once we do the derivation, we will get basically the equation for the economic growth with respect to CBI. So we have solved this equation, and we find 2 thresholds. The lower threshold of 1,800 and then 18,000. The lower threshold and upper threshold. And in order to get basically the highest point of the parabola of the quadratic equation, we also solve this equation, and we get 5,845. And those are here. This is the lower threshold, this is the highest point, and this is the upper threshold. So what is the basically interpretation of this? You can see the impact of independence on growth for poor countries, middle-income countries, and rich countries. So this point, which is 5,800, this is basically the threshold for lower-income countries. Within the 2 thresholds are middle-income countries, and this is the threshold of higher-income countries. Countries who have per capita income of 18,000 and above. So you can see that the impact of central bank is negative, but weakening with the rise of per capita income. So you see it is in the negative, but it's actually the impact is getting smaller and smaller because it goes to the positive point. For middle-income countries, it's negligible, negative or positive, and also for the rich countries, it's negative. It is negative, but it is strengthening with the rise of per capita. So once the country gets more richer, having an independent central banks, the impact would be negative on economic growth. So there are two mechanisms. We have written this paper together with Vladimir. So there are 2 mechanisms for this. In poor countries with bad quality of institution, there is always a danger that a central bank will expand the money supply under pressure from the government or the interest groups. Greater central bank independence provide a kind of a blocking mechanism. This is the reason of why the impact of independent central bank is negative for poor countries. And also, in less developed countries with poorly functioning markets, there are a lot of price rigidities. Loose monetary policy in this case can alleviate the negative impact of price rigidities on growth by ensuring that actual output approach potential. If central bank is too independent, it does not care about output and unemployment. Therefore, the impact is negative on growth. These results suggest that central bank independence is hurting growth in poor countries because it prevents moderate inflation, which is necessary to grease the wheel in rigid markets. In rich countries, the impact is also negative because basically in rich countries, they have democratic institutions. I mean, the democratic governments, which does not allow, the difference between poor and rich countries is that the central bank independence is not really needed in rich countries for avoiding very high and hyperinflation, even if the central bank is subordinated to the government. There are democratic accountability mechanisms at work that prevents the government from pursuing irresponsible monetary policy. Well, that was one of the estimations that we did. The second estimation that we had, we just used the linear interaction term. So this time we did not use the quadratic form. I mean, the square of the interaction, we just take the interaction term, which actually provides us with a better results. Again, you can see the results are significant. And solving for this regression gives us the threshold of 9,780. And this figure is actually coming from from this equation. So this is the threshold. So if the GDP per capita is higher than this amount, the impact would be negative. We are agree. And then if it is less than this amount, the impact is positive. It says that countries who are rich, their per capita income is above 9,780, the impact is actually negative. But for the poor countries that they have lower per capita income, the impact is negative. For lower income countries, the impact is positive. For rich countries, the impact is negative. I mean, in order to reconfirm, we divided the sample into two parts. Countries with above the threshold value and countries below the threshold. And we also get the similar results. I mean, we can see, that this is above threshold. So, this should be below threshold. Yeah, this is below threshold. The impact is positive, and this is the impact found to be negative. But for this case, this is, I will finish in just 2 minutes. The reason for the second regression, there are interpretations for this, and that would be too low inflation as a result of having an independent central banks may have negative impact on growth for developing countries. Because these countries need an industrial policy. However, this policy can be successful only partially. Some part of the project supported by government increases economic growth, but another part is unsuccessful and increases inflation. If the first part is large enough, then the impact of industrial policy is positive, but inflation may accelerate in short run. If the second part is dominated, then inflation may be too high and growth decreases. However, if the inflation restriction, which is an outcome of central bank, is too strong, then there is no room of having an industrial policy at all. Therefore, growth tends to be very low. Thus, the central bank independent and economic growth relationship impact is two-sided. The positive impact consists in preventing too high inflation, and the negative impact takes place if the inflation is too low. And then in the very poor countries, governments are not able to choose effective projects and to control inflation. Therefore, central bank impact central bank independence impact has to be positive. In the middle income countries, quality of governments is high. They are able to conduct effective industrial policy, but the central bank independence may result in too strong inflation restrictions. Therefore, independent central banks will be harmful. In our sample, we had countries like Ethiopia, India, and Indonesia that they had basically an explicit low per capita income, but we had countries who had initially low, but they catch up at the later stage. We have taken into account, I mean, we divided, but at the end, it is not clear why central bank has negative impact for advanced countries. So we had one interpretation because they have better institutions and democratic accountability, while for this case, the absence of any impact seems to be more plausible. I mean, either no impact. Nevertheless, additional calculation for countries with GDP PPP per capita above the threshold also provides the same results. Well, we are still working on this. Maybe we need to take into account maybe more advanced econometric techniques that results, that justifies the level of threshold. Thank you so much.
Thank you.